On today's show, we have our guest, David Gould, and I'm going to ask him a very difficult question on being judgmental and what is reasonable to expect of people and when to hold them accountable for their behavior. Yes, I would say our government should do more to help people, and yes, the super rich should be more generous, but how much of our the negativity in our life, how much of is that of our own making? For example, if you gossip among friends and there's drama, there's no one to blame but yourself. Or a big example might be doing volunteer work with the homeless. Yes, I think as society we should do more to help the homeless, but when you work with them, even on a volunteer basis, I often hear them talk about how they often pick fights with one another, steal from one another, smash each other's stuff, trash each other's tents and whatnot. No one's making them do that. Or if you go to a poor end of town, yes, I mean, they're suffering economically, but if you see graffiti on the walls, who's doing it? I don't think a lawyer from the upper class of town or an engineer or professor is driving down to the poor side of town, with a spray can and taking their old running shoes and throwing it over power lines, or taking a pair of handcuffs and handcuffing a shopping cart to a stop sign. I don't know why that happened, but anyways. So, I mean, how much of our own suffering is that of our own making versus just life and versus just what others have done to us? And what is reasonable to expect of our political leaders and of our religious leaders? And what is our own personal responsibility for ourselves and to others? How do we practice discernment on these questions? David Gold?
Well, you raise an important matter. I think that our normal way of thinking about it
Mhm.
in this society is often quite defined by where one sits politically. It does seem to me that within our society these days, people who identify with liberal or progressive stance, they look at these situations and they simply immediately say, this is a failure of government.
Mhm.
Government needs to do more. If you talk to people on the more conservative side of things, they tend to get fed up with the government throwing good money after bad around a number of these matters. Just here in Edmonton this last week, as you would know as well as I, our city council decided that the tent cities, the people living rough, had to be gotten rid of.
Mhm.
And so they went in and cleaned them all up and presumably found some housing for some of the people. So there's a couple of things just to think of about this historically in the political sphere. Why did conservatism develop as a political perspective? Conservatism developed as a political perspective largely among people who were well off and who were part of the establishment,
Yep.
bourgeois, aristocrats. It develops a few hundred years ago. And one of the principles of the conservative perspective is that within a society, those that have means and those that have power must care a bit for the poor and for the disinherited, for those that are limited in their capacity. And they must do that because if they don't, they'll get a revolution. Those people will be marshaled and they'll start tearing everything down. So that's a conservative principle. I think most of us these days have a habit of expecting things of government that government can't do.
Yes.
I mean, government can do certain things, but government can't walk with you.
Mm-hmm.
Government can't be in solidarity with you.
Mm-hmm.
Government can't be your friend.
Yep.
Government can try to level the playing field
Mm-hmm.
through equity legislation. Government can provide a safety net in a complex society.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have a safety net so that people, when there are dramatic changes, they get another chance to get on their feet. But we tend in with these two political perspectives, the liberal progressive perspective tends to think that government policy can solve things, and the conservative perspective knows it can't solve everything. And at its best, it tries to make room for ways that some of these things can be solved. So let me illustrate.
Mm-hmm.
We have a social service system that is there to provide a safety net for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
Social workers are trained in universities, and then when they are employed, most social agencies are under the government. There's some private social agencies. But the social agencies under the government, the habit has been for the social worker to be a mediator between the policies and the clients,
Mm-hmm.
and to see that they get the money they deserve, and to check to see that they're maybe spending it the right way.
Yes.
So the social worker becomes a kind of bureaucrat and policeman. Many people that are in poverty, and particularly if they're in intergenerational poverty, it's one thing to give them money. It's another thing to spend time with them
Mm-hmm.
and to walk with them. Some of them don't know really how to cook or how to shop.
Yes.
So it's a question of doing with them, not simply providing, but
Mm-hmm.
doing with them and doing it in some kind of solidarity. So my own view is that we should have far more non-governmental agencies engaged in doing social work, because non-governmental agencies can care about the policies which may govern them as well, but they also can do things differently. Don't have to do things bureaucratically.
Mm-hmm.
They can do them with some regard for what the real need is here,
Mm-hmm.
not just how we can keep the person alive, but what the real need is. You know, Michael Ignatieff, who ran for prime minister here a number of years ago, from one of Canada's first families. His father was a very fine diplomat for Canada. And Michael Ignatieff grew up in the Orthodox Church, by the way. He wrote a book when he was in England. He's a fine intellectual, whatever you mean as a politician. He wrote a book that I think is a remarkable book called The Needs of Strangers. And he's a liberal, but he examined what had happened in the development of our social service system when it comes to the poor. And he argues in it very compellingly that we care for the body of the poor. That is, we see that they can have food, sometimes a place to sleep, but we abandon the soul. We care for the body, but we abandon the soul. That we've created a society in which things that are meant to be done with people are now done bureaucratically for people. So this is part of the deep, I think, problem that we face here. So that's on the sort of governmental and social level. On the level of religious communities, I think of our Orthodox Church. I think this is seen quite differently. First of all, it's obvious
Mhm.
from Matthew 25,
Mhm.
from this discourse of Jesus Christ, where it's sometimes called the last judgment discourse. I don't like that term, but it's often called that, where you have the sheep and the goats coming before the king or the judge on the last day. And he will separate the sheep from the goats. You know the text. And he says to the people on his left, he says, when I was sick, you did
Mhm.
not visit me. When I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was naked, you did not clothe me. When I was in prison, you did not visit me. Depart from me.
Mhm.
And they will say, Minister, when did we see you like that? If we'd ever seen you like that, we would have responded, obviously.
Mhm.
And he says, as oft as ye did not do it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did not do it to me. And then he says to the people on the right, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick and imprisoned, you visited me. Enter to the banquet table of the Lord. Now, often this is read through the prism of judgment at the end of history, but that's not what it is. It's about, it's a revelation about what happens in history, in our
Mhm.
time. Because the people on the right who had responded to whoever it was they saw, who was hungry in whatever ways they were hungry, hungry
Mhm.
for friendship,
Mhm.
hungry for a healing word, hungry for play, hungry for whatever it might be, naked, spiritually naked, wherever it might exist, imprisoned in whatever prison they might be in, because we have our own prisons that we keep ourselves in, and sick in whatever ways that might be. The people had reached out to them. People had realized that. So they had, for a moment, through the grace of God, responded to that. I love the word responsibility, but I like to flip it around. What is your ability to respond?
Well said.
What's your ability to respond? And if you have an ability to respond, why wouldn't you respond? What's in the way of you not responding? It's probably some kind of fear. So I think within our, our religious tradition, Vladimir, the the issue is, I don't think the issue is ever offloading onto somebody all their responsibility for the predicament they've gotten into.
Mhm.
You know, Father Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's great novel, says we are responsible for everything and everyone because life is connected. People aren't impoverished for no reason. We have their reasons, and I probably have benefited from them. People who suffer from mental illness,
Mhm.
suffering from it simply because of themselves, as if they were isolated creatures. They
Mhm.
had parents, they had grandparents, they had brothers and sisters. Something happened. And so suffering is a deep shared part of our life. And it should be something that we seek to respond to. Can we make it right all the time? No, we can't.
Mhm.
But can we make it better some of the time? I think we can. And so we need to, when we see people in difficulties, we need to see, discern capacity to respond. But at the same time, given some of what you suggested,
Mhm.
we also need to rest with things that we can't change.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean just departing from it, and it doesn't mean making it worse. It means sitting with it, and it means maybe giving a piece of bread to it, maybe responding a little bit to it, even if we can't solve it. We can usually respond.
But I'm going to add more to this conversation. How much is one's own suffering of their own making versus something that's happening external? For example, I've talked to many of my friends who are immigrants, and they have done very well coming to our country and they've added a lot of value. But the stories they told me about their country, the government is corrupt, the administrators are corrupt, but even a very large percent of the population, they take bribes, they don't pay their taxes. There's a joke, you know, to get a license instead of passing a test, you just pay up some money, and now you can do a job that you're grossly unqualified to do. Like driving a semi truck and not knowing how to drive a standard or use air brakes. I hear these horror stories of all of these people taking bribes, and it's so how much is these nations these dysfunctional nations? How much of it is it just something that's just happening versus how much is it the common people doing it to themselves, and how much can actually be blamed on the government? I've had friends say, it's corruption from top to bottom, and it's like, well, how do you fix this? And like, how much of your suffering is of your own making? That's the question.
Well, we can ask sociologists to help us
Mhm.
understand what's going on in various countries. Um, I mean, we'd have to look at something specific to think about that.
Mhm.
But at least from my understanding of Christian perspective around
Mhm.
this, as I understand it, based on our tradition, nothing, nothing, period, nothing is of your own making.
Okay.
We we have a beautiful image of this at the heart of the liturgy,
Mhm.
at the very center of the Eucharist,
Mhm.
where the priest and all of us gather, and where, in reference to God and to Jesus Christ and the incarnation, the words are said over the bread and the wine. Thine of thine own we offer to thee.
Mhm.
Thine of thine own we offer to thee. This world belongs to God. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to you. We belong in this world because we belong to God. And so there's a deep connection, deep relationship that is associated with all human suffering. All human suffering is missing the mark in some fashion. And so we are responsible through the Holy Spirit, with the help of the Holy Spirit, to do what we can to heal the world
Mhm.
and to do it everywhere because it is thine, because it is God's world. We're not responsible to make it work. We're not responsible for some utopian notions about
Mhm.
it. We are responsible to be merciful to people that need the oil of gladness in their life. So, of course, everybody makes decisions. I do. Sometimes those decisions are decent, sometimes they're not. And if you have some capacity and if you have relationships, people will pitch in and help out. I'm always amazed at wealthy people who talk about pulling themselves up by their bootstraps when they inherited $20 million. I mean, the issue is that isn't, and I know some wealthy people who take this very seriously. They know that their wealth is not theirs. They know that it comes from somebody.
Mhm.
It comes out of the collective work of many, many people,
Mhm.
and that they have a responsibility as stewards to see that it's spent well.
Yeah.
So, uh, my sense is when we see suffering of all forms, we are called to do is not correct it, not see that it doesn't exist. We are called to be in solidarity with it.
Mhm.
We're called to come alongside. And sometimes if you come alongside, it's going to make a difference.